So the title of this presentation was Genealogy and Identity. And what we're really talking about when we talk about those words is we're really talking about the impact that the genocide has had in the loss of our family histories, our family relations even. And the effort that's gone on to try and recover those. And there's a lot of people out there that are actually trying to do that. There's always been the misconception that there are no records left, that the records have been largely destroyed, and most of the people that would know have passed on, and there's nothing more that can be learned. So a great many Armenians don't even begin to attempt the effort at trying to repair this rupture caused in our family histories. I personally was not willing to take those answers myself and for my own family. The stories I'm going to tell you today are not unique in the sense that they will resonate with you because they're the stories of your families as well. But in fact, they're only part of the story. In a mathematical sense, the information we have would be called a biased sample. The bias is that the only information we have is from those that survived, not from those that perished. So 2/3 or more of the story is untold, or is told through only the 1/3 that survived. My grandmother was one of 5 sisters, and in 1915, she witnessed her father's murder, saw his decapitated body left by the river. She was taken as a slave to a Muslim family, as was one of her younger sisters. The younger sister cried all the time, and the family took her to an orphanage. At the orphanage, there was a woman responsible for every 6 children. As it so happened in my grandmother's sister's group, the woman that was responsible had 3 of her own children as part of the 6. She fed her 3 children all of the food, and my grandmother's sister died in the orphanage of starvation. 2 of her sisters, the oldest and the youngest, infant and teenage wife, married sister, were sent on the death march with their mother, and they were never heard from again. My grandmother lived as a slave to this Muslim family for 6 years before her one sole surviving sister, who had been living in another village, had a son, had married a Muslim man to protect her son. They had killed their son anyways, an infant son. I do not know how she survived the intervening years, but she survived. And 6 years later, she would come to find that her sister, my grandmother, was still alive, and she rescued her. And my grandmother was able to escape as a result. But many didn't escape. And if you travel these lands, and as you look at the photographs, and Matthew has done a wonderful job documenting these, Avedis, who's the next speaker, has done a wonderful job documenting these accounts of meeting the remnants of those that were taken if my grandmother had not escaped, right? Those that were left behind. That's part of the story of the 2/3. Right? Because we have included them as part of the dead until now. They have been counted as part of the 1.5 million, but they didn't all die. Many of them were taken, particularly women and children. And my grandmother's sisters that were sent on the death march were of the perfect demographic to survive. An infant child left on the side of the road could have been taken in, maybe even raised not knowing their ancestry, not knowing their roots. A teenage girl that was deemed attractive enough might have been taken as a wife. And in 2012, I was in the village of my grandmother, walking the land of her story that she had told me. And we met a man there. And the man asked, "Why are you here? Why are you in this small village, no place, in the out-of-way, no place?" And I was with my cousin, the grandson of the sister that rescued my grandmother. And we said, "Our grandmothers were born in this village. They were both Armenian." And he said, "Oh, I'm half Armenian. Both of my grandmothers were Armenian as well." Again, not by choice, taken and left behind. And as we traveled around and we talked to people, and they would be thirsting to find their relatives. They would know something. They would know Gadabed, Miriam from Kharpet, nothing that we could act upon, nothing that could be researched enough to make the connections with these lost souls. Souls that felt like we had forgotten them, souls that felt like they were dead to us and we considered them dead. And there are plenty of these stories out there. And I would travel around, and even one time a woman came after me as I was walking away, and she said, "Why didn't you stop and say hi?" She thought I was her grandson. I looked so much like him. And every time I would meet these people, I'd think to myself, could this be a descendant of my grandmother's sisters? Maybe they had survived. And there was no way of knowing if that were true and how to make that connection until the DNA testing came about. And I took the DNA test in hoping beyond hope that maybe a descendant of one of my relatives that thought had been perished might take this test in Turkey and we would find each other. And it so happens that in the very trip where that woman thought I was her grandson, when I came back in 2015, 100 years after the crime began against our people, 100 years later, I came back and there was a close DNA match to me. Somebody that was listed as a first or second cousin. And it was somebody from Turkey with a Turkish name. And I reached out to them, and they told me this story. They said that they knew that their mother, grandmother, they knew that she was Armenian. That during the genocide, she was on the march with her sister, an older sister, and that a cavalry officer saw the older sister and said he wanted to marry her. And she said, "I'll only go with you if you protect my younger sister as well." He agreed. So they went. And the older sister had a son by this man. The son passed away. The older sister passed away, leaving the younger sister alone. A Kurdish man came to the house, fell in love with the younger sister, and they married. They had 3 children. He passed away, remarried, had 3 more children, and this man that had DNA tested was a son from the second marriage. This story matched my grandmother's story exactly, her sister's story. I said, I found them. They survived, and I found them. I asked him, "Do you know what her name was, Armenian name?" And he said, "Yes, Vaskanush." That was not any of my grandmother's sisters' names. So I asked him, "Do you know anything more? Who could this be? I'm wondering, who could this be?" And he said, "Yes, I know what her parents' names were." Her parents' names were Andreas and Anna, and that only turns up one place in my family tree. When I was growing up in Rhode Island, and Rhode Island is going to be very excited because they're mentioned in at least 3 of the talks today, so they're going to be truly excited. When I was growing up in Rhode Island, my great-grandmother lived with us the last 3 years of her life. I knew her very well. She died when I was 13 years old. Her parents' names were Andreas and Anna. She had had a sister that was taken during the genocide that my parents didn't know about, that the family didn't know about. And this was my great-grandmother's nephew. And in 2015, again, 100 years after the crime, I went back and I met my cousins in Turkey. And it was an amazing connection, The interesting aspect to this story, this name Vaskanush, which I had never heard, is that there are some of the main sources that people use when they're looking into their family histories is the Hushamadians, the memorial books written about each of these villages. And there is a book written about the village of my great-grandmother. And my family was farriers, horseshoers in that town. And recently, about 3 or 4 months ago, it occurred to me to look in the book to see if there was anything written about the Nalbans, the farriers. And there was a section in the back that talked about them, and there happened to be 2 paragraphs about my family in there. And it told this story about the mother, a son, Khachadur, and a daughter, Vaskanush, that were thrown into the Euphrates River and killed. Now, Vaskanush is not a name I had ever heard. Again, this just confirmed what the family told me. What's interesting is their story that was handed down to them was that it was an older sister, and that the older sister had a son by this man that took her in. But after reading the story, it occurs to me, and I think it's most likely the situation, that it was not an older sister, but her mother, that had married this man to protect her daughter, and that the boy that died was actually her brother, something, again, we had not known about. So what's the reason for all of this? Why am I talking about this, and what's the implications? The genocide continues to this day. It is not a crime that has ended. Not just through the denial, not just through the cultural destruction of our heritage on those lands, but also through the separation of our families, the continued separation, the continued rupture in our family histories. And today, by working on this, by simply trying to repair this rupture, in its own way, it's fighting that. It's fighting that injustice. It's putting one brick back in. And quite honestly, it's bringing those that were presumed dead back to life. Instead of 1.5 million, it's 1.5 million minus 1. And isn't that, and we're running out of time, quite honestly. This is the last opportunity we have to do this. And so I encourage you all to take those steps so that those people that are still living on the lands know they're Armenian and have a thirsting knowledge to reconnect with their history. Those that felt like they were forgotten or considered dead, let's bring them back to life. Thank you.